Hi, I'm Mr. Elan. This is the second mini lecture on the technique and composition packet. This is set to the rule of thirds in scene modes. Scene-specific modes, the three we're going to deal with are portrait, landscape, and kids and pets, or sports, or action, whatever your camera calls them. Scene-specific modes are exactly that. They are still automated, but they are doing some things internally with the camera to sort of optimize for a particular scene or situation. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about the rule of thirds, which is a photographic principle that governs dynamic balance. The rule of thirds should be thought of as a tic-tac-toe board, and two things about the rule of thirds. First of all, they call it the rule of thirds. It's not a rule. It's a guideline, and as you'll see, it has certain effects that you may or may not desire depending on what you're going for. Ultimately, the rule of thirds serves one primary purpose, which is to get stuff out of the middle. A lot of the times, people will even look at this diagram and think that the middle is where they need their subject, and they'll even reshoot the picture if it's not in the middle. And as you're going to find with some of these examples, that shouldn't be your default. The middle should be a choice that you're making if you want your photograph to feel a certain way. Otherwise, use the rule of thirds. Another thing about the rule of thirds is that there are kind of two rules of thirds. So it's based on a tic-tac-toe board, and the first rule of thirds is anytime there are lines in your image, you kind of want those lines to line up with the 1/3 or 2/3 line vertically or horizontally. The other part of the rule of thirds is where those lines cross, which I'll refer to as like cross points or hot spots. Those are good places to sort of situate focal points. That's not to say they need to fit inside there, but that a focal point might be aimed or centered toward this point, this point, this point, or this point. So, we're going to see that in action. First of all, here's a picture of a boat on the horizon, and you might be looking at this thinking, wait, does that follow the rule of thirds? And you'd be correct to think that it does not. So, if we look at this photo, it doesn't make it a bad photo that it doesn't follow the rule of thirds, but it makes it feel very still, very calm. If my intent as a photographer is to photograph something that is meant to feel still and calm, if this is meant to be about just, getting on a boat and floating out who cares where and just enjoying the feeling of the water and bobbing up and down barely and the sights and sounds and, sort of being relaxing, then this composition makes sense. However, and I'm in Photoshop so that I can use the crop tool. One thing you might notice or have noticed already about the crop tool is when you go to use it, the same is true on like smartphones a lot of the time. When you go to crop something, it puts this grid. That grid is to remind you of the rule of thirds and to suggest that you might want to position it, let's say like this. So that once again, I'm following the rule of thirds in two different ways. I have a strong horizontal line that's lining up with one of my third lines, and then I also have a subject that is lining up with this cross point between the second horizontal line and the first vertical line. So if I go ahead and just crop it that way, notice how even though it's the same image, it feels a little more active. It's going to have a tendency to feel as though, rather than just floating there, the boat is casting off into adventure. Now, I'm going to undo what I did. I initially picked, the bottom line for the rule of thirds. I can just as effectively pick the top one. I can stick it like all the way over here if I want to. So whereas the other one emphasized the sky and therefore maybe felt more about the space or distance off into the horizon, this one emphasizes the ground, which in this case isn't the ground, it's water, and that might kind of better imply the idea of danger on the high seas. Another way of looking at it is in Western culture, we read left to right. So with the boat being a little further off to the right, it kind of seems like more like it's like it's going away. It was over here and it went over there. If I crop it the other way, once again like this, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's coming, but it kind of feels maybe a little more like the journey is beginning as opposed to they're already gone or the journey is at an end. So there are a lot of different ways that the rule of thirds can be used or intentionally ignored, and ultimately it not only serves to create a more interesting visual balance. In other words, when I'm not using the rule of thirds, this and this are just kind of like equal, and therefore they almost cancel each other out. So the big thing about the rule of thirds is it balances things more dynamically. It creates a more interesting relationship between different elements of the image. But it can also have a psychological effect. Here is a portrait image. I don't know who this person is. I assume that, it's probably like from a TV show or something. And I do want to kind of point out that if I just go ahead and let's say I crop this like a mugshot or a school picture or something like that. I know we already saw what it looked like without it. But this becomes, like, again, very static, kind of still, objectifying in a way. It's almost it almost seems as though it's meant for the viewer to just look at this person and look at how they look, which is exactly how school pictures and mugshots feel. They don't tend to feel like they're about the person's personality or how they're feeling or what they are into. So if I undo that, this isn't like perfectly following the rule of thirds. In this case, I would say that she's taking up enough space that she's becoming more linear than anything, which is fine. But just the idea of, I'll crop down to simplify it a little, just the idea of balancing her off to the side, especially in the case where she has this gaze kind of pointed toward this empty space. We don't see what she's looking at, but balancing this off to the side makes the whole thing not only more visually dynamic, but again, much like the boat feeling more like it's moving rather than sitting there, this is going to feel a lot more psychologically engaging. We're starting to think less about how she looks and more about what she's looking at and what she's thinking about. And is that a judging expression on her face, or is it something else? One example that gets thrown around a lot with the rule of thirds and how to use it most effectively is the runner on the beach example. And we'll talk about this probably a couple times in class. Here we have a runner on the beach, and it's a little bit long, but if I specifically crop it, I can get this to follow the rule of thirds pretty well with, at least with the linear aspect of the runner. And here we have another runner on the beach example, and it's already following the rule of thirds pretty well. One of these ends up feeling a little more natural and effective than the other, and it's happening because of the way space is being used. Once again, independent of the runner running from left to right and the way we read, we definitely have the feeling that the runner is running in a particular direction, and in the case of this photo, it's working a little better because the runner has space to run into. Over on this photo, the runner is running kind of off the frame, and it would be one thing if we saw really strong footprints or we saw a horde of zombies chasing her. If there was a reason to have this space back here, it would make a little more sense. Without it, it kind of feels like extra space and also kind of creates some tension just psychologically with the runner kind of running this way, but we don't see what's here. And usually, unless you're going for psychological tension, you don't want to create a situation where the viewer wishes the photograph was a window and they could poke their head out the window and see what's happening over there. So in the case of movement or in the case of a gaze, you may want to kind of point the direction of the gaze or the movement toward the empty space. A simpler version of that is a fish in water, and this is kind of all tying everything together. The idea that a asymmetrical balance creates a feeling of movement, symmetrical balance creates a feeling of stillness. The fish is off to the left. There is space for it to move into. It kind of feels maybe like it's swimming a little bit, even though we can't tell. If I crop this so the fish is centered, it's going to feel a lot more like the fish is just floating there, even if, in fact, it was actually swimming. sometimes with the rule of thirds, we have very clear, obvious lines. So the obvious line here that's following the rule of thirds, or it's coming very close, it is worth noting that the rule of thirds is not about nailing that line perfectly every time. People aren't like getting meter sticks out at photography competitions and awarding the tiebreaker to the person who wasn't off by a millimeter. So it's about just aiming. Really, it's about, thinking about that tic-tac-toe board. It's about avoiding the center and avoiding having things be too far over to the side or too high or too low to create visual tension. So in this case, we have a really strong vertical line that is aiming for the third line. We also have a really strong focal point that is aiming for where those two lines cross. But we also have what can be referred to as an implied line. This implied line is kind of where the sky meets the ground. And if you look at that, it's really more of a diagonal line in this case, which can feel dynamic but doesn't necessarily directly apply to the rule of thirds. But there is also going to be a sense in the viewer's mind that, we know that there's a horizon out there. We know just from living and existing on this planet that the sky and the ground, whether you want to philosophically debate whether they actually do touch, but visually they meet at a line that is horizontal, and that line is called the horizon line. So in this case, that horizon line is pretty close to that bottom third line, and again is working as an implied line. Here is maybe an even stronger instance of implied line. And there isn't really much of anything that is following the rule of thirds here, but there is a clear sense, in terms of the way the lines are working, there is a clear sense of chaos down here, just in terms of like busyness and color and movement and everything. There's like chaos down here, and then just geometric order up here. So looking at this entire image, even without there being a bold black line cutting across it, there is a sense that if I was recomposing this image, I might want to put this line, this implied line, right on the third line. So when you take your pictures, all three of your subjects are going to involve the rule of thirds. The first one in portrait mode with the subject on the hot spot, those crossing points. The second in landscape mode, you're going to take a picture outside, off into the distance, and you're going to aim the implied or direct horizontal horizon line on one of the third lines. It doesn't matter which. And then the third shot you're going to take is going to involve a moving subject, and you're basically just going to like copy the runner on the beach example. In other words, you want space for them to move into, whether they're moving left to right or right to left. You want space for them to move into, rather than just empty space behind them that feels extra. So in terms of the three modes you're going to be using, portrait, landscape, and then kids, pets, or sports, or action. The class cameras call it kids and pets. Sometimes it's called sports. Sometimes it's called action. Sometimes it's, who knows, it might be called something else. So as far as what those modes do and what to look for, it's pretty simple. First of all, notice that this photograph is following the rule of thirds, or it's coming close. The focal point, which is the bride's face, is kind of aimed toward that crossing point. Ultimately, if you have like a newer iPhone, you probably know what portrait mode does. It blurs the background and keeps the face nice and sharp. Thinking back to simplicity and emphasis, that's also a technique you can use to simplify things. And essentially make the focal point more clear. Landscape mode is kind of the opposite of portrait mode in the sense that whereas portrait mode has what's called a low depth of field, in other words, something is sharp and something is blurry, landscape mode has a high or long depth of field in which everything from here to eternity is in sharp focus. We'll learn more about that, about both of those when we learn about aperture. But for now, this is an automated mode that allows you in a situation like this where you're thinking, gosh, the mountain's so beautiful, I don't want that to be blurry, but this stuff up here is so beautiful too, I don't want that to be blurry. It lets you have it all. Finally, we have kids, pets, sports, action, whatever your camera calls it. It's an automated mode that freezes time. It is worth noting, so here we have this ball just floating in midair with no motion blur whatsoever in the middle of this game. So with this one, once again, you're going to copy the runner on the beach example. Just have a friend run around in front of the camera and then try to time your shot so that you've got some space for them to run into and they're following the rule of thirds. Ultimately, this picture does have to be taken outside, so you can follow the same protocol you followed with the pinhole project, and go outside with a friend or your partner or whoever and take a picture of them just running or jogging or whatever. If you do not take the picture outside, you don't have sunlight, and therefore you probably don't have enough light to actually see what the mode does. So if you show me a picture where you used Kids Pet Sports Action, but there's motion blur happening in it, or the person wasn't moving fast enough to really see what it does, you're going to have to retake it. And that's true of all of these pictures. You're going to have to take a picture that fits not only the conditions that you're going for in terms of composition, but also like the basic function of the mode and what the mode is for. In other words, a portrait is a face, and a lot of the times there's face detection. So you do have to take a picture of a face. Landscape mode, you can't just point it at the wall. You have to be able to see a lot of space to see what it does, and that's why, again, I'm requiring that you take that picture outside or at least point it out the window. This set only has 3 photographs that you take, but there is a little more to each one. You got to remember to multitask. You know, every time you're taking a picture, you are not just thinking about what mode you're in or what composition you're going for. You're doing both at once. Keep that in mind. Good luck, and once you finish, you can move on to set 3.